Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me this morning is Dr. Aykan Erdemir. He is the Senior Director of the Turkey Program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Aykan, welcome back to Turkey Abroad.
Thanks for having me. Always great to join you.
Well, we're going to be talking about the weighty topic that was Monday's meeting between Joe Biden and Turkey's President Erdogan, which, of course, was long anticipated from the moment Biden entered office through the cold shoulder that he provided Erdogan with for 3 months before having a phone call where he offered to meet with him on the sidelines of this NATO summit. And after the meeting ended, we didn't really see much in terms of a significant breakthrough on any front. Whether it was Erdogan said it himself that Turkey's stance on the S-400 remains the same thing when it comes to the Syrian Kurds. And he did also add that he saw signs that Biden wanted a quote unquote productive relationship with Turkey. So what I want to ask you first is, what did you think when listening to Erdogan describe this meeting with Biden? What was going through your mind as you watched this all unfold?
On my end, the immediate reaction was no surprises here. I had very low hopes as to this meeting. I wasn't expecting any breakthroughs whatsoever. I was keenly aware that the deep structural disagreements in U.S.-Turkish relations are simply too vast to be solved, on the sidelines of a NATO summit in an, interpersonal meeting. I know this is Erdogan's MO, meaning this is how he pursued U.S.-Turkish relations under the Trump presidency, when he had a U.S. counterpart who also looked at foreign and security policy issues in a radically personalized manner. But Biden, since his candidacy, made it very clear that he would return U.S. foreign and security policy to the institutional domain. He would transition from unilateralism that marked Trump to multilateralism and close coordination, especially with NATO allies. And he also emphasized pushing back against authoritarianism and autocrats. And here comes Erdogan to the scene, who has been a spoiler within NATO, an enabler of Putin, and the first and the only NATO recipient of Russian S-400 air defense system. Hence, Biden's cold shoulder for over 3 months. And now in this meeting, which was, quite extraordinary. There were no diplomats, no note takers. Even the interpreter for Erdogan was not a Turkish foreign ministry interpreter. It was the daughter of a former, AKP official, now ambassador. So this was a very informal, let's say, arrangement, especially on the Turkish side. And as expected, that did not lead to any diplomatic breakthroughs, given the constraints.
Speaking of that choreography, so to speak, of the entire meeting, I want to ask you something on that, because Biden met with Erdogan for about 45 minutes or so with only their interpreters. There was no note takers, no diplomats, and a comparatively shorter meeting then took place between the wider delegations on both sides. And I couldn't help but think through all of this about the furor that kind of gripped many analysts and the media, like when Trump held these similar formats, of course, with Putin during his presidency. So I want to ask you, why do you think there's no similar outrage when it comes to Biden having this meeting with Erdogan in this similar format? What do you think?
That's really an interesting question, because on the Erdogan side, this was expected. But on the Biden side, this is in stark contrast to his emphasis of institutional relations and proper diplomatic channels. Again, the question here is this Biden accommodating Erdogan's special wish, Or was this, as some analysts, a few analysts argued, was driven by Biden himself? Some claim that Biden had some hard truths to deliver to Erdogan, and he preferred this format. But I have questions about that. I believe this is more Erdogan's MO, believing that he has a magic touch, that he can put things back in order only if he has a one-on-one, with his counterparts. So this is Erdogan in the full transactional mode. But I doubt that, regardless of the format of the meeting, that anything could have come out of this meeting. And as expected, even in Erdogan's presser, we have seen that he stated that the various committees will take over from now on, and that the foreign ministers and defense ministers would be in charge of future negotiations. And to me, the striking point was that, yes, this is no news, right? This is a presser, but there were absolutely no news delivered, because
there's no questions either on the American side.
Yeah, and in between two NATO member states, precisely this is how things should, move on. And to me, the striking thing is that what Erdogan delivered in this presser is indicative of how marginalized Turkey has become within NATO, because it was as if this was not a long-standing NATO member, but a newcomer, from an adversarial bloc, emphasizing there will be diplomatic talks, there will be these direct channels, there will be ministerial meetings. And, you wouldn't expect this kind of a statement, from French officials or German officials or British officials, right? This was almost an evidence that things have been so strained that back to some semblance of normalcy is now celebrated. But the markets have a keen eye for these developments, and I think they got things right. After a week of lira rally, lira being boosted by these news of a potential breakthrough, we have seen in the immediate aftermath of the bilateral meeting, the Turkish lira erasing all its gains against the dollar. We had yet another, downward cycle, because the markets realized there was absolutely nothing that the bilateral delivered, and that Turkey and the United States remain on a potential crash course with the CAATSA sanctions and in other fields as well. Hence, I always think, we should lend an ear to the markets who realized there was nothing to be delivered here.
Mm-hmm. That brings to mind two additional questions there. The first one I'd like to ask you is, I got a reminder of a analysis I read actually this morning about the meeting between Biden and Erdogan, in which they were discussing how there was no readout released by the American side, or even questions asked by the American press about Biden's meeting with Erdogan, on top of the fact that Biden seemed to make it a priority, of course, to use this week-long trip to really listen to American allies and build support ahead of his meeting with Vladimir Putin, which is going on right now. But one of the implications that they suggest in that article was that basically Biden is following through on a belief that many analysts felt, that he wants to deflate this notion that Turkey is too big to fail for America, and he's treating Turkey as a bit of a secondary partner, like as you framed it, almost like a new member of NATO that's still sort of like joining from an opposing bloc and learning the ropes. Do you think that was something that was going through the Biden team's mind when arranging this, that they would be trying to take away from that notion that has been in the Turkish mindset for a long time, especially as under Erdogan, that Turkey's too important to ignore?
I think right from the start, the Biden administration has made it clear that a return to a trust-based, ally relationship is not necessarily in the horizon. But given the strategic importance of Turkey, Washington has no intention of pushing Turkey further toward Russia and China. Hence, I think for the Biden administration, transactionalism is the name of the game here. They are looking for a few areas of potential win-win, cooperation with Turkey, while at least having a moratorium on some of the outstanding issues, trying to prevent them from escalating further. And as you said, there is a choreography here as well, and that is in the run-up to the Biden-Putin meeting, Biden wanted to give as strong an image of a NATO, on, cooperative terms with other member states as possible. And it was, I think, also smart to show that even Turkey is willing to play nice with the United States and NATO in the run-up to the Putin meeting. But we should make no mistake, Putin is a very shrewd political operator.
Absolutely.
He knows where Erdogan stands, and he will never be fooled by the theatrics in Brussels or elsewhere. He knows what leverage he can use against Erdogan, and he knows very well how Erdogan can serve him as a spoiler within NATO. Because let's keep in mind that regardless of all the fanfare in the Turkish media, about a very successful meeting, let's just take a look at, the last year and a half. Turkey most recently blocked NATO's criticism of the Belarusian dictators, hostage taking, basically, hijacking of a plane. And before that, Turkey watered down NATO statements against, Russian military intel's attacks against Czech ammunition depots, as well as, Russian hackers attack targeting the United States. And the same Erdogan government blocked NATO's defense plans for the Baltics and Poland, and blocked some other cooperative, arrangements with third parties. So when you put all that together, Turkey is really, or Erdogan is really a leader who keeps on delivering for Putin. So no matter what the theatrics, what the optics of this Brussels bilateral has been, I think Putin will still know that Erdogan is a Trojan horse within NATO, and that after all, Biden does not have such a strong hand.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other question I want to ask you is that, as we mentioned, there wasn't really any significant breakthroughs in this meeting, but there's one topic that came up that got a little bit more attention, and that was Afghanistan. Of course, you know of Turkey's proposal to provide security for the Kabul International Airport after the U.S. withdrawal. And Erdogan devoted some of his time in this press conference to talking about possible cooperation in Afghanistan. But what do you think about that proposal? Do you think it's a feasible one, or do you think it's more of a confidence building measure that he wants to throw out there to the U.S. to show, hey, Turkey is reliable still, and we can help you here? What do you think?
I think that is a sign of how good of an political instinct Erdogan has. In the Trump era, he knew business interests would basically be on the top of Trump's agenda. And now in the Biden era, Erdogan has realized that Biden has a ticking clock, that he is under enormous pressure. And now that he has committed to leaving Afghanistan by 9/11, which means there is all this pressure to make various security as well as humanitarian arrangements. And in that bind, Erdogan reached out saying, we are willing to provide security and run the Kabul airport. And given Turkey has some goodwill in Afghanistan, there are ethnic, linguistic, religious affinities, and long state-to-state cooperation history. But then comes the spoiler, right? Last Thursday in Qatar, in Doha, a Taliban spokesperson said that they expect the Turkish troops to leave alongside other NATO troops, alongside the U.S. troops and other NATO troops. So, meaning by the time the bilateral in Brussels took place, Erdogan no longer had a strong, hand to deliver. Uh, that's why I think he upped the ante. In the press conference following the meeting, he said he proposed a new formula. He said Turkey would like to provide security alongside Pakistan and Hungary. Now, that is a big question mark, right? I think there's a lot of skepticism about that formula that Erdogan presented, whether it's viable, whether that would be welcomed by the Taliban, or whether that would be anything of interest to other NATO allies. But ultimately, I think this is one of Erdogan's, again, selling points. He is looking for a transactional deal. He would like to deliver aid in an area where Biden feels, at least calendar-wise, under pressure. But my final take on this issue is this is too late, too little, meaning, yes, Afghanistan could be an area of cooperation between Washington and Ankara, but this is not kind of the magic wand Erdogan has been looking for, meaning this will not help him resolve the long list of really deep, serious structural problems in U.S.-Turkish affairs.
Too little, too late. Sounds about right there. I would just like to rewind a second back to the NATO summit again, and from Biden's side, of course, as I also mentioned, he didn't really receive any questions at his press conference related to his meeting with Erdogan. But he did call the meeting productive, and it seemed to me that he was expressing some confidence that relations with Turkey will continue to progress despite these difficulties, even if the main focus of his whole trip was basically to build support ahead of his meeting with Putin. There was a lot of hype, of course, going into this meeting. So maybe for some people it's a bit anticlimactic that we don't really have much to go on than sort of sorting through the tea leaves of what Biden and Erdogan each said and how they conducted the meeting. But it does seem to reaffirm what most observers in the Turkey watcher community really felt ahead of this meeting, that it was, of course, more important for Erdogan from the beginning to have this meeting than it was for Biden to speak to him than the other way around. That still, would you say that's fairly accurate?
No, yes, this was a very asymmetric meeting from the very start. Biden had, very limited expectations. He was simply trying to maintain a strained relationship, whereas on the Erdogan side, the economic clock is ticking, right? Turkey's foreign currency reserves are way in red, around, negative $60 billion range when you exclude swaps. And Erdogan signaling that he has other options, by announcing in his final press conference from Istanbul, right before the Brussels meeting, that Turkey has just secured yet another swap deal with China, is really an empty gesture, meaning, yes, now the Turkish-Chinese swap deal has reached $6 billion, and it's a yuan lira swap deal. It actually serves no real purpose for the Turkish economy. It simply helps Erdogan mask that Turkey's foreign currency reserves are in the red. So given, Erdogan needs an urgent way out of Turkey's financial meltdown, this meeting was crucial. The anticipation helped him boost the lira for a week. But as of today, we're back to where everything began, right? We're back to the drawing board, meaning such theatrics, such, media stunts can't really solve Turkey's structural problems. The economy needs urgent reform. Erdogan is in no position to deliver those reforms. On the foreign policy front, Turkey's growing isolation continues. Yes, we had some theatrics earlier this year with, so-called rapprochement outreach to, Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But I think at this point, we are all aware that there is not much progress to be made. We have seen that the fiasco with Israel, where everything is now, back to zero. Yeah. So my quick take is, if Erdogan was hoping to gain a week, yes, he succeeded. But if he was expecting anything more beyond that, I think he wasn't being realistic. So today he is back to square one. He still has, a currency in nosedive. He has record level unemployment, especially youth unemployment. And he has not only an economic policy, but a foreign policy that happened to be on the verge of a breakdown.
As part of that, I want to also ask you about the situation for human rights and democracy inside of Turkey that we've seen Biden bring up time and time again since coming to office. His administration's been generally less shy about calling attention to any number of anti-democratic or human rights abuses that have taken place in the span of his entire administration, which is, of course, a complete break from the 4 years of the Trump administration, where it did not really come up at all in these public statements. But since we didn't really receive a readout about the discussion between Biden and Erdogan, and Biden didn't elaborate in his press conference about what the two of them discussed, we don't know if they actually discussed human rights or not. We can probably assume that it came up, but since we didn't have any of those materials, there was no joint press conference. We just really don't know. So if you had to speculate, though, do you think Biden brought these concerns to Erdogan and just chose not to really address them publicly to sort of, give him some breathing room? Or what do you think, if you could speculate, what do you think his strategy was when it comes to the human rights topic here?
I think Biden had a strong hand here. That he didn't even need to raise the issue, because he could always argue, look at my administration's track record. Since, late January, we have had numerous official statements from the White House, from the State Department, from the state spokesperson, National Security Council, Deputy Secretary of State,
President himself, too.
Yes, so President himself, and on a wide range of issues, from Osman Kavala to Selahattin Demirtas, two of Erdogan's political prisoners, to women's rights, to LGBT rights. So basically, the Biden administration has had a strong track record in calling out, flagging, the Erdogan regime's excesses and transgressions. But now the real question at this point is whether the Biden administration is willing to take the next step. And the next step is, concrete policy steps beyond rhetoric. Yes, the Trump administration, maybe with the exclusion of the Pastor Brunson case, refrained from calling out the Erdogan regime. But ultimately, Trump was the first U.S. president to use global Magnitsky sanctions against Turkey. So now the key question is, for example, when it comes to Osman Kavala, the Biden administration is willing to use the global Magnitsky sanctions. Really a key tool against against Erdogan's human rights abuses. And more importantly, will the Biden administration remain true to its promise and reach out to allies, Canada and the European Union, which also now have similar global Magnitsky tools in their hands. So if Biden is truly committed to transatlanticism, this could be a unique opportunity to issue concerted global Magnitsky sanctions against the Erdogan government for his treatment of Osman Kavala. Furthermore, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has been for years recommending the State Department to designate Turkey now as a special watch list country. And to be frank, being a NATO member, Turkey has often received, a lenient treatment from the State Department. So this year, and I would argue that it's a unique year because this comes in the aftermath of Erdogan's conversion of Hagia Sophia, really inciting discriminatory language against Turkey's Christians, and more recently, horrible anti-Semitic statements condemned not only by the State Department, but also House and Senate, task forces against anti-Semitism. So I think this is really the year when the State Department needs to take that step by following USERP's recommendation to designate Turkey as a special watch list country. Definitely Erdogan's track record last year deserves such a designation. And in fact, many experts say it deserves more. It deserves the top tier designation, which is a country of particular concern designation. But the first step is, of course, the second tier designation. That is the special watch list designation. So my big question to the Biden administration is, will they be willing to take the next step? That is back rhetoric with concrete action. And regardless of all its shortcomings, the Trump administration was the first administration to put some of these punitive measures, concrete punitive measures into force.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last thing I'd like to ask you is that now that Erdogan was given his chance to speak to Biden and some of his other rivals at the NATO summit, like Mitsotakis from Greece or Emmanuel Macron, of course, from France, he's basically returning home without any concrete, like what Biden's team always used, the term Biden's team always used, deliverables. Basically, we had statements, sure, but there's no breakthroughs, nothing concrete that he can say that he was able to win over at the NATO summit. So where do you think this leaves Turkey to go from here in its relations with the U.S. or NATO, frankly, writ large?
I think at the end of the day, the Biden administration will be satisfied if things do not escalate further. And I'll be very concrete here. There has been 3 Turkish cross-border operations into Syria, and the last one particularly targeting U.S. partners, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And if there isn't a 4th cross-border operation, the Biden administration, I think, will be satisfied. If Turkey does not receive additional Russian military hardware, yes, CAATSA sanctions will remain in place, but at least the Biden administration will say, okay, at least it's not a further escalation of the problem. If Turkey, again, does not escalate things in the East Med, if things remain in deadlock, that's still a win. At least there isn't an East Med crisis the Biden administration has to deal with. So I know these are really very low expectations. They're not proper expectations from an ally. They are almost like minimal expectations one would have from adversaries. But I think that in a way reflects the mood in Washington. Let's keep in mind, this is not just an executive branch issue. Erdogan might see it as such. Erdogan might see Biden as the all-powerful, head of the executive. But separation of powers and checks and balances are very much in place, as we have also seen during the Trump administration. And there is a uniquely bipartisan and near unanimous consensus in Washington, across the aisle, in both chambers and beyond, about Turkey. I just spoke at the caucus, Senate Human Rights Caucus yesterday. And, that's, again, the mood. Turkey has, or Erdogan has, very few friends in Washington. And the Turkish people have now a growing advocacy community who raise their voice for their rights and freedoms and the rule of law and due process in Turkey, which means until Turkey's 2023 parliamentary presidential elections, I think both the United States and the European Union, as well as NATO, are in damage control kind of mode. And possibly everyone is hoping that Turkey can transition back to a functioning parliamentary regime in 2023. And then I think the real bilateral and multilateral negotiations will begin to put things back on track with Turkey.
Aykan, it is always a pleasure to have you join me here on Turkey Abroad to talk about all these. So we are at the end of the program, but thank you very much for taking the time to join, and look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you, Nick. It was always a pleasure as this time.